with me, though. It's so much fun.
On the shore I stand alone. Ocean's whisper calls my name. Depth and longing in my soul, seeking more than just this game. Waves crash softly at my feet, echoes in my heart so deep. Eyes on horizon far and true, longing for a love so steep. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Crash softly at my feet, echoes in my heart so deep. Eyes on horizon far and true, longing for a love so steep. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Shells and sand beneath my toes, tides reveal what ebb and flows. In the quiet still I hear whisper longings crystal clear. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Ocean mirror, soul's desire, burning with the holy fire. Depth of love beyond all dreams, in the vastness it redeems. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore.
Okay, we're going to switch back to that one. I had the wrong one up. All righty. Hey, everybody. Oh, it's so good to see everybody. Hi, Ernie. It's good to see Ernie dropping by. And of course, Roddy. Roddy's here. Roddy's a good friend. Always good to see him. Deborah, it's good to see you. Always glad to see Deborah. And I thought I saw Nunya here too. Yeah, Nunya. Nunya keeps me on my toes when it comes to Torah. So this will be fun because he definitely is pretty educated on this. So Nunya's going to keep us on our toes today, Adam. Right. Adam is back with me. I'm so excited about this. We had so much fun on the last one. And I think that as we're going on this series, this is one that I added at the last minute. I was kind of like, surprise, I'm going to add this one. And Adam was like, hey, I want to join. That sounds fun. So here he is again with us. So for those of you who missed the last one, this is Adam. So Adam, give us a minute and introduce yourself a little bit.
Yeah, my name's Adam. I run the YouTube channel called Linguas Amo. Or at least I, not we, but I mainly focus on Old Testament stuff. Nerd out on it just as much as you do. History and archaeology mainly, but I think I've delved into some theology a little bit, Old Testament theology. I currently have one master's degree in biblical studies from Liberty University, and I'm currently pursuing my second master's degree at Talbot Seminary, Biola University, in the Old Testament. So that's me currently. Future aspirations to do a PhD, but it's probably going to be Old Testament text criticism for that.
You're braver than I am, man. Old text criticism, that is a sinkhole of fighting about a whole lot of stuff. I tell you, you want to get into a fight, getting into studying the Bible, get into text and canon. Those guys, I swear, they have a lot of time on their hands or something.
Right?
They
Props to Dr. John Mead.
that's actually one of the main reasons text criticism and canon is one of the big reasons that was involved in my switching tracks for my thesis and dissertation idea. So because
Oh,
I got that far and got to the whole canonical argument, and I was like, nope, I'm out. I don't even want to get into that fight of whose canon
right.
we should
Just
use. And
reading Brevard Childs is intimidating because he was on the
yeah.
textual approach, canonical text approach, and when reading him this semester, I was definitely daunted.
Mhm. Well, and if you're trying to make an argument that the canonical order matters to understanding the narrative, then you get into the fight of who's canon, because in the Old Testament you've got the
Mhm.
Tanakh order, you've got the Protestant order, you've got the Catholic order, and you've got the Eastern Orthodox. And
Yep.
everybody has their own opinion and their own list. And some of them, I think the Orthodox don't even have a closed canon. So that it was like looking at that mess, and I was like, you know what? That is, I will deal with that on this kind of level, but that is not a dissertation field that I want to even touch with a 10-foot pole. So I'm switching tracks on that. So I get to rewrite 6 months worth of work and research for August when I start working on my thesis. So anyway, enough of that. That was fun. So we are going to talk about in this episode actually canonical narrative. So we are talking about the Torah, which the sense of Torah, because last time we explained all of the ways that Torah gets used, and the way that that word gets used is gets used a lot of different ways. So today we're talking about Torah in a couple ways, but primarily as in the reference to the first 5 books of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, which most of us think of as the Pentateuch, because that's the 5, right? But you'll see actually even in the Gospels, Jesus refers to the Pentateuch, and so as the law or Torah sometimes. So I think we talked about and touched on that at the end of last time too, about some of the confusion around some of those references. So we are going to dig into the Torah and the narrative and some structure things going on with the first 5 books, and trace the story that's happening there and each of the books, and how all of that is going to set up a bigger context to understanding Torah itself. So this is the stuff I love to really nerd out about. So this is going to be fun, but I had to make slides to keep us organized, because otherwise the rabbit trails would get us all so lost and confused. So we are going to go ahead and jump right in. So we're going to look at this most of the time. I don't like the blue dot there, but there's nothing I can do about that. So Torah, meaning the first 5 books. And actually, technically, Torah means one book with 5 parts. So each of these, what we call books, is a section of the scroll of Torah. So, we'll get into that in a second here, because there are 3 sections to the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, which is the order that most now Jewish traditions use. And that goes back to, I believe, the Masoretic, when they set that and got that all organized. I think we can trace the concept back further, but I think it was formalized back with the Masoretics and the setting of that order. So, and they break that into 3 sections. The first one is Torah, and just for fun, I put the Hebrew word there for people so they can just see what it looks like. Don't expect anybody to read that, really, unless you're a Hebrew nerd like some of us. But we got Torah, which is the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we're going to go through those today. Then you've got the Nevi'im, and those a little, some of these get a little strange for people who aren't used to the categories in the Tanakh. So this is broken into 2 sections. First, the former prophets, which a lot of us think about as the books of history in our Old Testament. So this is Joshua, Judges. Samuel is one book, by the way, for people who that's a new concept to them. So we're used to First and Second Samuel, but that's one book in Hebrew. And then Kings, which is also one book in Hebrew. So because those are one scroll, that's why they consider them one book. And I think they were broken up to just make it easier to find things in those books, to break it down to be smaller chunks, if I remember correctly. I think you're muted.
I was gonna say that. Oops. That's my understanding too. Is that it was just broken up to make things easier.
Yeah, and then we've got the books of the latter prophets, which this is I think, it is my first love getting into Old Testament studies was the prophets, although now because of becoming, because of starting in the prophets, I've had to become so versed in Torah that I've come to just really love Torah, and it's given the prophets a run for their money at this point, but I still love the prophets. These guys, this is the books that we think about, that make up the last of the Protestant Old Testament. Is the
Hmm.
bulk of the end of the old Protestant Old Testament is these latter prophet books. And then you've got what's called the Ketuvim. And to kind of help people understand this category, we kind of think about this like it's kind of like the junk drawer. Like everything else that isn't Torah or prophets gets put in this category. But there's also a structure here. So it's broken into 3 sections. First of all, the prophetic books, or the poetic books. Sorry, I get the prophets in my head.
No worries.
Get me started on the prophets and I get going and I don't stop. So the poetic books, Psalms, Proverbs, Job. And oh, I'm not sure why they put Job. Do you know why Job is considered a poetic book?
I,
Because there's a lot of poetry in it.
your your guess is as good as mine. I'm not really sure why.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Okay. Anyway,
haven't gone
moving
over
on.
that yet.
Then you've got the 5 Megliot, or the scrolls, which are Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, depending on which tradition you're in. Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. And then you've got the others: Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. So this is this is how the Tanakh is broken down. And we're gonna do some more stuff with the rest of these books on another video. We're just focusing on the first section right now, so we're not going to go as much as it would be fun to nerd out about that. We're going to move on and get into what we're
Yeah.
talking about. So we're going to jump into basically just start in Genesis and go book by book. We're not going to go like chapter by chapter or verse by verse. That would take us forever to do that, but we're just kind of go book by book and look at the narrative structure and what's happening in these books on like 1,000-foot view. So we're not digging into individual stories, we're not digging into individual things, we're just looking big picture view to understand how each of these books fits into the bigger Torah first 5, and then put all those pieces together. So we're starting with Genesis, and Genesis is really interesting. This happens a lot. You see especially in these first 5, you'll have pieces that are cooked together with a link that bridge these two parts of this together. So in Genesis, it looks like chapters 1 through 11, which is the story of God in the whole world. And then
Mhm.
you've got the covenant promise to Abraham in chapter 12. And then it shifts to a focus on God and one family, and telling the story of God being getting back to dwelling with his people and how that happens in one family. So there's a
Mhm.
big focus shift between the two. So when we go back and we look at the first section, God and the whole world, that's 1 through 11. There's some really beautiful things we see happening in these stories here. So first of all, you've got God brings order from chaos, which is demonstrated through creation, but it's also demonstrated in some of the rest of these stories in these first 11 chapters. You see that theme hit over and over and over again. And blessing is a key word in the book of Genesis, especially in these first 11 chapters. And I kind of want to sit there for just a
Mhm.
second, Adam, and just kind of talk
Yeah.
about blessing and how that's baked into these stories, especially creation,
Hmm.
because that seems to be one of the big pieces of the mystery of why did God create man in the first place. And blessing is a huge piece of that. Out of the overflow of blessing, God wants to share that, wants to share the love and blessing, and so he creates the world and man to be in
Hmm.
relationship with him. So how is that going to be different in the ancient Near East mind when these stories about God's blessing introduced? Like that, to talk a little bit about how crazy and revolutionary this idea was.
Um, well, one, it was revolutionary in the sense that there was a deity who actually just wanted to bless his creation, because in Mesopotamia, for example, in cities like in Babylon, in the Babylonian Empire, the old Babylonian Empire, and the old Assyrian empires, the gods created humanity to work for them. So they were there to literally take the place of the Igigi, the lesser gods. They were to replace them and do the work for the gods. They were feed them. So the humanity, if they wanted to receive a blessing, the gods didn't care. Plain and simple. So if you wanted to receive a blessing, you would pull the strings a little bit, offer sacrifice or something to receive in order to receive a blessing. Or if you wanted the god to not be angry at you anymore, you would offer a sacrifice. So the gods were rather indifferent, or they just, I think indifference is the correct word for it. They were just indifferent. Now, um, Genesis here, the writer in Genesis here, flips everything on its head, and you have a God in the Old Testament, particularly in Genesis, since that's their focus, who wants to bless. You see that in the opening chapter, as you said, in chapter 1, where there's a garden and they're allowed to eat everything except for the one tree, from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then on and on it goes. In the book, I'm not sure how much I can divulge here. But
Yeah, no, go ahead,
throughout,
because
I was going to say throughout
gardens,
Genesis,
yeah.
it's a recurring theme. Blessing
Mhm,
is a recurring theme
mhm,
in there. And I think in Genesis 4, um, well, no, that's slightly different. We'll get there, but
mhm,
I thought it was blessing. It's not. But you get blessing in Genesis 1, and then you see it through the 12 sons at the end of the book,
mhm.
particularly with Joseph and his two sons. So yeah, I love it. It's a recurring theme throughout the book, and it doesn't even stop in Genesis. So
Mm-mm. It's a theme throughout Torah, and it echoes
mhm,
in the imagery that is introduced all over the place that we'll see as we walk through this of the garden. Gardens are everywhere in, especially in Torah. Like God
mhm,
is trying to bring Eden back. Eden imagery is everywhere, trying to remember, remind people what was lost and what we're trying to get back to. So we'll see it all through as we get to, especially when we get to nerding out about the tabernacle and a bunch of the stuff that's going on with the offerings and the blessings that are offerings of produce and things that come from gardens. Like it saturates this idea of blessing, and it's so, you're right, it's so backwards from being used to people who were in essentially just serfs to the gods. They
mhm,
were there to serve their deity, to provide for them, to live off of, leech off of them, and they were left to survive on the scraps. And instead, God is the one who is outpouring, wants to
mhm,
bless them, and over and over and over throughout these first 5 books talks about, I want to bless you, I want to bless you, I want to bless you. And you see this Genesis, these first 11 chapters really sets up a conflict narrative that we see all the way through to the end of the book of Revelation,
mhm,
where God wants to bless, but it's constantly running up against humans' need or want to rebel. And there's just this
mhm,
constant back and forth battle of God's wanting and giving us that blessing, and us refusing and walking away for whatever reason.
mhm,
So, and we see that played out all the way through all of scripture, but it starts here, and especially in these first 11 chapters. And you see that as you go through, you can go through chapter after chapter, story after story. God blesses, man rebels. God blesses,
yeah,
man rebels.
man rebels.
There's just the pattern is just, it's crazy how consistent that pattern is here. So, but for chapters 1 and 2, we got order being brought to creation, not only on a world level, but on in setting up relationship with man, with humans in chapter 2. And chapter 3 begins this descent into chaos, which in Hebrew thought, at least, and I think we can get there linguistically, is decreation. There's a lot of decreation language that's going on
Mhm,
here about what's happening. And so you'll see this decreation theme also popping up repeatedly throughout, especially the Old Testament, but it's
Hmm.
comes up in the New Testament as well. But it goes back to this cycle of creation, of blessing, and then rebellion, decreation, and then wanting to get back to recreation, to restoring us to the garden. So it's this beautiful pattern over and over and over again that gives us hope, actually, that we actually, we
Yeah.
get to go back to dwell with God, because that's the ultimate goal. So yeah, like I said, story after story, starting in the hope of blessing, ending in failure, descending back into chaos. But it's always left with the hope that something else is, that will be restored. Return to God, return to God, return to God. Happens over and over and over. And that gets hinged and hooked together with the next section in chapter 12, 1 through 3. And we get the covenant promise to Abraham.
Yeah.
And then we shift our focus from the whole world and all of humanity to how is God going to do that? He's going to choose a family to do that. And
Mhm.
he does that through the story of the family of Abram. And you see this pattern that kind of starts with Noah, but it really comes out in the family of Abram, in the family of Abraham. Is each one of those generations, is this the one we're waiting for? Is this the one we're waiting for? And
Mhm.
what every story after story, person after person, they end up failing, not being the one that's promised that's going to come and fix it and restore it back. And so it's just this constant battle of showing that man's just not ready. Man's just not ready. People just aren't quite ready yet. And so yeah, Adam, let's talk about a little bit about that pattern, because it just is constant, like, grind of
Mhm.
when is this one coming? And we're still just in
Yeah.
Genesis.
Um, as far as the Hebrew Bible is concerned, and you have this cycle, I think one of the big the big cycles is Judges. The book of
Mhm,
Judges really highlights this cycle of there's going to be a quote savior, if you will, who saves them from their rebellion. Whether that's the judges, they're one they're from the best or the greatest to the least because they're didactic. I think Judges highlights that cycle very well in the Hebrew Bible. And you see it in Genesis too. Getting back to Genesis, you
mhm.
see the cycle again. You see Abraham. God chooses Abraham. You have the Abrahamic blessing go on, and then Abraham fails. As far as not waiting for the son, the promised son, he fails. But God still blesses him and delivers him. It gives him a son, and then he works through him. And then Isaac, again, what's he do? Fail.
Mhm.
And then again, he brings him back, and then you get to Jacob. Jacob, like
Yeah.
it's cyclical, cyclical, cyclical. You get their sons, the 12, and they try to kill Joseph. Um, and then through Joseph brings him right back around and blesses him again. So at least that's it. It's as we've been talking about, it's just a recurring theme throughout the book of Genesis. But outside of Genesis, I think Judges really highlights
Mhm,
this cycle. The prophets certainly highlight that cycle where they
mhm.
fail, especially using the exile as a great example for most of it. So um, yeah, absolutely.
When this is also a good way to see unexpected patterns, because those
Mhm.
also really emerge here in this part of the second, like most of the rest of Genesis. We see this unexpected pattern saying, interruptions of patterns are very significant, especially in this ancient Near East context. You're used to a pattern. This is the way things are supposed to go. And then you get an interruption. And that starts
Mhm.
pretty early with Ishmael and Isaac. And then we see it again with Jacob and Esau. So let's just, I didn't put it up on the slide. And I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but I do want to drop and hesitate on that for just a second, because it's important. Because I want to be acknowledged that those two, Ishmael and Esau, are
Mhm.
passed over because they're not the family member that God has identified as the one that is the line. But that doesn't mean, so Adam, does that mean that God hated Ishmael and Esau?
Absolutely not. He actually blessed them. If
Mhm.
you believe it or not, he actually blessed Ishmael and his wife, not wife, wow, oops, his mother Hagar. He actually
Mhm.
blessed them so and provided for them. So certainly didn't abandon them. So you see that blessing theme there. And with Esau too, he blesses him, although there was some conflict between the brothers there. He still received a portion.
Mhm.
So it's just that God didn't work through that particular part of the clan. Um, so I see that as far as binary, the literary term is binary opposites. Jacob and
Mhm.
Esau are binary opposites, yet Ishmael and Isaac are binary opposites, in that God uses one, Isaac works through one, but not the other. But he doesn't ignore the other. He blesses both of
Mhm.
them. So,
Well,
um,
yeah, and we see in like the former prophets, like in Joshua, Judges, and in the prophets themselves, it was always the intention that the family in line of Ishmael and the family in line of Esau were to be brought back into the family. They were
yeah.
never thrown out of the family of Abraham. They were never thrown
Mhm.
out of the inheriting a portion of the blessings of the family of Abraham. In fact, Joshua is given instructions, don't bother these parts because they are
Mhm.
descendants of Abraham, and they were supposed to bring them back to the family. They were supposed to be reconciled. Well, of course, you know, those of us who've read through the entirety of the Hebrew Bible understand how well that went. They
Yeah.
just never quite that never quite
Never.
worked out very well. But eventually, Christ brings them back through, and when he
Mhm.
reconciles all the world to him. So they do get brought back in, just not as they were supposed to be
As they were
originally.
supposed.
But I just love that, because there's this misunderstanding that God cursed and hated Ishmael and Esau, and I just shake my head and say,
Nah.
no, he made, and God even used the descendants of them to prepare the promised land for when they got there, for
Mhm.
at the end of Deuteronomy, and they're waiting, ready to go into the land, and the spies get there and they go, and all this stuff. Because when you look at they're promised as part of the promised land, one of the things that they will be
Mhm.
able to is harvest olives. Now, I don't know if
Yeah.
any of you know anything about olive trees, but those things take a generation or two to mature, to
Mhm.
produce edible olives. And so if you've got, so the fact that God is preparing the land to be ready for Israel when they get there, that takes generations to get that all
Mhm.
work, because they're promised they won't have to build houses, they won't have to till fields, they'll be able to harvest olives. All of these things take time and generations. So, they do also serve a function to help prepare the way for their brothers, who are the ones who carry the promise. And then in that faithfulness, they're supposed to be brought back in. So it's really interesting, how all that works.
Yeah, you
So,
definitely see the blessing highlighted in the book of Joshua, preparing the way and
mhm,
everything, and then they go in to take possession of it. And contrary to what some critical scholars have said, that it's genocide or they went in to blah blah
mhm,
blah. You don't really see that there. You see them capturing cities instead of destroying
mhm,
cities. Yeah, there's some hyperbolic expressions in there where they killed everyone or whatever, but I think it's based off of a misunderstanding of
mhm.
harem warfare and everything. But I don't want to get too sidetracked. But
Right,
the Joshua,
right.
definitely there is certainly blessings as far laid out for the 12 tribes of Israel when they enter the promised land in Joshua. So.
Yeah, I'm gonna get to Joshua eventually. Joshua and
Right.
Judges, 'cause you have to do them together, because they're
Yeah.
they're that binary opposites thing going on there in Joshua and
Yeah.
Judges. But, yeah, so getting back to our thing here. So each
Yeah.
generation, this is one of the things I love. Each generation fails and brings disappointment, but each generation also demonstrates God's faithfulness, because God never gives up on the family of Abraham. Person after person after, I mean, they're a bunch of, if you look at this family, I mean, talk about a narrative that can give hope to our tired and struggling world right now, because over and over
Yeah.
and over again, this family is a disaster. Abraham, that ends, he was a disaster. He tries to, he ends up trying to give Sarah away twice, to, don't kill me, here's my sister, she's my sister, take her, don't kill me, like, there's Hagar, and that whole, like, there's just all kinds of drama, every single one of them. Isaac turns out to
Everywhere.
be a mess with Jacob and Esau. Jacob, that turns out to be a mess with Rachel and Leah. Like every one of these generations, the 12 sons, and they become the 12 tribes. I mean, talk about a disaster and a mess. They sell their brother into slavery. And it just, over and over and over. But God takes all of those failures and he's faithful. And I love that Genesis 50, it ends with setting us up for the hope that's coming. And Joseph tells his brothers, you all planned this for evil, but God planned it for good. So God is going to take this repeat pattern of failure and he's going to turn it on its head and make something good and beautiful come out of it. And that's where we end Genesis there, waiting for okay, what is God going to do? Because they're stuck in Egypt. What's happening with, they've been promised land. What's going on here?
And Exodus starts off continuing that blessing, like God blessed the line there, and then they were multiplying so fast that the Egyptians were worried in chapter 1. So it picks up that blessing in Exodus.
So which is a good time. We're going to stop for just a second and interrupt the flow here because I want to stop here. So we're about to get into Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. There's a lot of Torah here. So I want to just kind of stop for a second and what we do when we don't understand the laws. I use that word specifically because I want to kind of talk about that for just a second. I want to get stuck here too long, Adam, but I think this is helpful for people to remember as front loading context going in. So here's some tips to remember as we're getting into all of this stuff that we think of as the books of law with all this do's and don'ts coming up here. So first thing, remember, these are written to ancient Israel in a very different context from ours. That ancient world that these laws instructions were written in is so unimaginable to us right now. We have no conceptual way to understand their lived experience with this kind of world, this kind of chaos, and how different these laws and instructions were to the nations around them and the purpose that they had. So you want to give us like a 2-minute 2-minute summary on how that works?
On the instructions. So the instructions are, well, like you said, they're extremely different than ours. We tend to view law as statutory. So the ancients really didn't view law as statutory as we would think of it, where it's a rigid set of laws, and if you break one, then we have to care what is the punishment, and it didn't really work that way. We may have touched on this the last time, but the instructions were, okay, if this happens, your punishment could be this, like it's meted, like it's like the worst punishment. So if you carry that punishment to the end, that's what it could be. It's not necessarily what will happen. So whereas today we moderns will tend to view these instructions as somewhat statutory, and that's not really how they worked out, not only in the context of ancient Israel, but in the context of the ancient Near East as well. The law code of Hammurabi isn't really a law code. What I found out recently was that the law code of Hammurabi wasn't even in the local courts. It was only in the royal courts. So they never made the laws of Hammurabi, never made it down to the average Joe living in a city somewhere working a day job. I don't know, as a blacksmith, or not a blacksmith. They didn't have blacksmiths then, but you get my point. So they had a separate court dockets, but the court dockets never really reflected the law of Hammurabi. So in ancient Israelite context, it operated something similar to that, not quite where it was just royal, because everyone had access to the law or the instructions here in Israel. So it's definitely, my point is that they really weren't statutory, but they really weren't guidelines either, and they reflected God's perfection, so to speak. So that's it in a nutshell.
Right. In a nutshell. I mean, it's hard to explain to somebody. So like the second point there, they're not copies of our understanding of quote unquote laws. So a lot of them outside, and we talked about this last time, so I don't want to get stuck here too long again, but outside of what we consider the 10 commandments, there aren't any thou shalt and thou shalt nots. The rest of them are if thens. So a lot of this is collective wisdom that comes out of lived experience. And God is saying, if
Yeah.
you do this, then this will happen. Or if you don't do this, like a
Hmm.
lot of it is rule, or not rules, but a lot of it is wisdom for how to contain the damage that people do to each other. It's how to
Correct.
preserve
Yeah.
life. Is a huge concern in all of this stuff. How do we preserve life? How do we care for your neighbor? Living
Yeah.
in community is the other major concern in most of this stuff. So that's very different from our, you know, merit punitive based court system. So
Correct.
it's a
Yeah.
very different mindset. So you have to pull yourself out of that and think, this is what happens when you talk to grandma about about stuff. Like, don't do this because this is lived
Because
wisdom,
this will happen.
is what this is, right? And so when we're reading these, because I think there's some, it helped when my first Torah professor, when the first time she made us read through these 5 books in one sitting, she said, every time you see the word law, replace it with the word instruction. And that really
Hmm.
helped for me to get my mind around that. There's getting it out of the mindset of these are laws, and these are wisdom instructions for what happens, for the best way to do this or the best way not to do this. This is really good, and community advice is a lot of what this looks like. So keeping that in mind, we're going to, from here on out, we're jettisoning the word law. I'm going to be using the word either Torah or instruction, just to minimize confusion. And so we won't be that. And so that's why you won't hear us use the word law pretty much for the rest of the series. We're going to jettison
Yeah.
that term for clarity, I think. So we're going to jump into Exodus. Good
Okay.
stuff. I love Exodus. Deuteronomy is my favorite, which is fun because it's the last book. But there's so much good stuff in all of these books that it's so much fun to nerd out on. So Exodus is broken into 2 main sections, and I separated these on Exodus because it really is like reading 2 books together. It really kind of is 2 books that are in, even more so than the rest of them, with one hinge together that holds them, binds them together, but they really are kind of 2 books. It's really fascinating when you look at it this way. So Exodus 1 starts picking up 400 years later in Egypt. They're still there. They're still sitting in
Yep.
Egypt at 400 years of suffering and misery. And one of the things I love about reading through all these stories is this passed on understanding as you read all of this stuff that the authors are really documenting really well, is the memory of suffering. And that kind of can help us as we're trying to cope with our own seasons of going through really tough times and suffering, because there's a lot of communal memory here in these stories of how people suffered. And so I just love, that's just a side rabbit trail. So we
That's
start
good.
out in these first sorry, I guess, like I said, my brain is rabbit trailing pretty hard today. So we'll do the best we can. So Pharaoh starts by trying to destroy Israel. So we get this is Torah. Pharaoh discovers, wait, what are all these guys doing in here? So Joseph is forgotten, the favor of Joseph is forgotten, the blessing
Hmm.
and the bounty that the family of Joseph has brought to Egypt is forgotten. And now all of a sudden he's got a problem with all these, where did all these guys with this family come from? Because they've done well, they've flourished. And now he's got, like, what am I going to do? And this isn't working out well for him, and he's concerned. So God tries to destroy them, and he tries to wipe out all the male children.
Yeah.
And we see again God intervening. And I find it really interesting, Adam, that in
Mhm.
that whole narrative of the trying to kill off all those baby boys, that the 2 names that really get brought out to the front are the midwives.
Yeah.
And all of the people who were involved in trying to destroy Israel. A conqueror's narrative would record their names, but this is a story told by survivors. And so the ones who are recorded are the ones who were part of of the heroes of the story, the real heroes of the story, are, these midwives, and we know
They
their
are.
names. And so I
Yeah,
think that's a beautiful thing that's preserved.
they really are.
Yeah.
And the fact that they were helping the Israelites produce twice as fast as the Egyptians was fascinating too. Without those two midwives, or at least in the account, you really don't have an Exodus without them.
Mhm.
Especially if Pharaoh's schemes were going to succeed. So yeah,
Yeah. So you get through all of that part, and then you get to the part that everybody's really familiar with is, Moses goes back,
mhm,
and the burning bush has happened. God sends him back, and you get a confrontation between God and Israel, or God and Egypt, sorry, between God and
mhm,
Egypt, and the people end up going free. So in Exodus 5 through 15
yeah,
is this story of conflict. So, and there's a lot of dispute, and maybe Adam, maybe you can kind of help us understand, because this is where I
yeah,
get a little fuzzy, because there's
okay,
a lot of confusion, because some people claim that each particular plague is tied to a specific god, but so many of these Egyptian pantheons had overlapping areas
yeah,
where it's fuzzy who was in control of what. So I think it's more my opinion, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. It's more
yeah,
of the pillars of Egyptian religious life are being toppled, and
yeah.
sometimes there's a god identified and sometimes not.
Yeah, if we could back up a little bit here, I find this I love this part about Exodus is the fact that you mentioned in Genesis you had the in in the first chapter you had creation, so you had
Mhm,
God's bringing order out of chaos and everything. And Exodus kind of opens up similarly with this chaos, considering slavery is chaos and chaotic. You have
mhm,
God bringing order out of chaos. So you see the Israelites bringing, or God's bringing the Israelites out of slavery here. And then it gets really chaotic with the plagues. Um, and the plagues are really an attack against the power of Pharaoh, the power of the king of Egypt, I think, rather than an attack on the Egyptian pantheon as a whole. Um, if you remember, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, or Pharaoh as he's normally called since Tutmosis II, I think. But anyway, Pharaoh is head priest of every temple in Egypt. So he controls the priesthood in the
mhm.
whole country, in all of Egypt.
Interesting.
So each plague is an attack on Pharaoh. It also is an attack against the Egyptian concept of Ma'at, which
Mhm.
is justice and just the way things are. And it flips it on its head, and everything is upside down according to the Egyptians. So that's what's going on in Exodus. And then, he brings them through the Reed Sea, which, we touched on the previous video. Um, and he brings them out of that chaos, and he births the nation of Israel on the other side. So you have this chaos. Out of this chaos, God brings in order. So,
Yeah, it's
um,
also the imagery of life is water that
yeah,
comes in here too. So, it's fascinating to see the theme of water through. There's so many, I mean,
mhm,
we could just, go for hours on each book at a time here. So, there's
yeah,
so much stuff here. But yeah, this is God bringing order to chaos, to which might confuse some people, because Egypt was a very ordered society, but not
mhm,
for Egypt, or not for Israel. Egypt was very ordered for Egyptians, but it was very chaotic for Israel. And so God is bringing order by bringing his people out, but he first has to topple the Egyptian order to bring these
yeah,
people out of that captivity of slavery, which is confusion and chaos. So
yeah.
yeah, I love that. You just see this, those that creation, decreation, recreation pattern over and over and over and over again.
You also see the theme of blessing again here too, because God blesses the nation
Yep.
of Israel, and or creates the nation of Israel, and that is the blessing. So, and of course,
Yeah.
they're not slaves anymore. That's a blessing too. So,
Yeah. And then we get to Passover, and Passover is important. So I want to stop here for a minute again too, because Passover is not only bringing Israel out, and it's one of the parts that is the birth of Israel, because it brings the nation out. It's bigger than that, because I
mm,
think it's the birth of the definition of who are the people of God. because it wasn't just the family of Abraham. It wasn't just the family of Joseph that came out. There were
Mhm.
Egyptians that came with them. There were other foreigners that came with them. This was a very eclectic group of people that were included. So all of them collectively become Israel, which is, primarily the family of Abraham, but that gets, God is meant shows us from the birth that it's meant to be
Mhm.
inclusive. So I think that's such a beautiful thing to remember that,
Yeah.
you
And
know, yeah, go ahead.
and if you notice it, you said the line of Abraham, and absolutely, but you also have foreigners mixed into there as well. So
Mhm.
it's not just them, it's the nations as well. You had
Yep.
Libyans in there, you had Nubians, you had Egyptians even in there. So, and you had these different people, these different ethnic groups leave Egypt along with the line of Abraham. So even way back then, the nations, the ethnic groups, was it the Pantata ethne, these nation
Mhm.
groups were already in God's vision and trying to redeem back then. So
Yeah, and Passover is one of those big moments where it's choose life or choose death.
yeah.
And so you get this meal that's prepared, and you get the Passover lamb, and that you get the blood over the door. And the
Hmm.
word Passover that's used there is really
Hmm.
interesting, because a lot of people, when it gets translated just like Passover. And the way that I was brought up, and the tradition I grew up in, it was always this mental picture of, like, the angel of death would see the blood on the door and skip over it like rocks skipping over a pond. Like, there was
Yeah.
just this kind of idea. And somebody asked me a question about this a little while ago, so I went and did a deep dive into that word. And I remember I
Hmm.
heard a couple of Messianic Jewish scholars who I really appreciate a lot of their work, talking about this one day on a podcast that I have to go back and find. But they were talking about that this word also can mean to be translated in a way that would be like to stand guard. So as the angel of death is going, everywhere the blood is painted, God is standing guard there. So he is saying, not this house, pass on by, keep on going. So there's this idea of God is standing guard in the blood of the lamb, which is such a beautiful thing that gets, if we bring that into the New Testament, like, wow, like, the blood of the lamb, God is standing guard over
Yeah.
us once again. So, I mean, it's an amazing, beautiful picture. And I love just that it doesn't change the story, but I think it helps
Hmm.
for me change the nuance of make it even more meaningful of the significance of that blood and that lamb and that coverage that we get with that lamb.
Yeah.
So,
Uh, it's it kind of leaves me speechless, to be honest, because it's just like that.
mhm.
Every time I read over it, I always find something new, especially in this book. The Passover in particular. There's also other things we talk about the Passover, but yeah, well, I'll
It's it's
not
kind of like the
because the
National
segue
Independence
into
Day, right? It's like 4th of
yeah,
July for Israel. There's, like, so much here. I know you could dig
it
into we could do a whole episode on it, but
yeah, we could.
but then we get to
Um,
chapter 15 and the
mhm,
song of Moses. And it's
yep,
this beautiful recounting of what happens when God is king. So he is summarizing Genesis and Exodus to this point, and just relaying and reminding everyone how what happens when they let God be king. It's just
yeah.
it's such a beautiful thing. And then we get into the wilderness,
Hmm.
and things go off the rails.
And then they fail. Yeah, they fail.
Right.
It reminds you of, the failures of Abraham,
Mhm.
Isaac, and Jacob, the 12
Mhm.
sons, and then they're freed from the slavery. They're blessed, to use the theme. They're blessed out of slavery that God had brought them out of slavery. That's a blessing. They become a nation, um,
Mhm.
with the intention of a promised land, more blessings,
Mhm.
and they struggle in the wilderness. Yeah. Take me back to Egypt. Take us back to
Right.
Egypt. We want to go back to Egypt.
And then the way I put that on the bottom there, it sets us up, I think, image thematic wise, where we're left wondering by the time we get to the end of all of this and start wandering in the wilderness, is the hardness of Israel the next Pharaoh? is Israel the next Pharaoh because they're hard-hearted and they refuse to listen? Like it just really sets up this picture pattern that is going to plague humanity until, you know, 5
It'll turn.
seconds ago. Like it's
Or
just still a
I'm thinking
problem.
long term. I was like, until Christ, but and then we still struggle with that. We're still in our wilderness because we're still
Yeah,
like
we're still
the
just
daily
wandering
drudge.
around,
Yeah.
hard-hearted, hard-headed bunch. So, all right, so we've been set up. Is Israel the new Pharaoh? Are they hard-hearted? What's going to happen? We've been pulled out, we're wandering around, and we get to Sinai. And this is, I think, some of the, I mean, this is fun. This is really fun
Mhm.
stuff here. So this is the giving of the covenant at Sinai, the giving of Torah. And so we
Mhm.
start with Exodus 19. God
Yep.
gives the covenant and Israel accepts it. So it's not like God declares and forces Israel into a relationship. God starts this whole thing with a choice, which is so beautiful to be like, Israel wasn't forced into this relationship.
Nope.
They had to choose to be in. They could choose to be. Once again, this picture that you see, these choices over and over and over, choose life or choose death. And at this point, they choose life because they choose God and they choose to be in covenant relationship with God. And we get the next 3 chapters in 20 through 23. I think it's 4 chapters actually, which we start
Mhm.
with the 10 commandments, which is like we've talked about before. That's the 10 thou shalts and thou shalt nots that
Yeah.
tell us how to love God and how to love our neighbor. And then we get 52 instructions of how to live out those 10, which,
Mhm.
that's really what they are. Those are the
Yeah.
wisdom of how to live those things out. And then we get to some of my absolute new favorites. I have become, because I've switched over and my thesis dissertation work is going to center really heavily on the tabernacle and the layout of the camp. And so
Mhm.
this is stuff that I am really digging hardcore into. So I have become I have fallen in love with the tabernacle. So you get a lot of chapters here. So chapters 25 to 31 isn't all about the blueprints for the tabernacle, which becomes a portable Eden. God is trying to recreate the garden imagery of what we
Mhm.
lost because God has to have a place of holiness to meet with his people, which is why this is so specific. And I mean, I would love to nerd out and just do the tabernacle for the next 2 hours, but we don't have that kind of time.
We
But
don't have the
the
time.
the tabernacle is God's way to bring Eden back to the people and he can dwell in the middle. So Adam, how
Mhm.
different is that from all of the rest of the deities and nations around them? That God is going in a mobile tent in the middle of everybody instead of in a permanent building on a mountain.
It doesn't exist in the ancient Near East. The gods never really wanted to dwell with them. I go back to Mesopotamia or even Egypt. Mesopotamia in particular because we have the idea of the ziggurat, and there was a temple there. And to really get the god to come down and bless you, you had to there was this idea of a garden next to the temple, and the food there was
Mhm.
the food was for the god. So to get him to come down, you would pray, you'd sacrifice and all these things, and then God would come down. The god would come down because the ziggurat looks like a staircase. The god would come down, eat,
Mhm.
bless, and then go back up towards the heavens. That was it. So the gods didn't dwell with the people. Again, they were indifferent towards them. And
Mhm.
when you see that imagery in the Exodus account, with the tabernacle and at the first temple, when you get to Solomon and First Kings, um, God literally wants to dwell with them, and He does.
Mhm.
So He, like you said, He creates this portable Eden, with the furnishings, with the temple furnishings that seem to resemble or at least hark back to the garden that we see in Genesis 3. So we're, yeah, Genesis 1, 2, and 3. Anyway, you get it. I'm sorry,
Mhm.
I got the fall there in mind when you mentioned
That's okay.
Genesis 3.
Right.
Um, but anyway, it harks back to the Garden of Eden, like you said. So um, that's what's going on there. Those 6 chapters with 25 to 31. And just a side note, because I go off on tangents like you. Um, one of the things about the covenant code I found interesting was that right after the Ten Commandments. I think it's right after the Ten Commandments. Yeah, in Exodus 21, the first laws that illustrate how we should, or demonstrate how we should live the Ten Commandments. The first law is the slavery against it,
Mhm,
regulations and
mhm,
stuff, which I don't want to go into because that's another video in and of itself. And I made a video on the very topic, but
mhm.
it's interesting that there it goes right after the Ten Commandments. It just flows right into the laws and the
Mhm.
instructions for slavery, which
Right.
makes sense because they just left Egypt
Right.
and came out of slavery. So
Yeah.
um,
They've
continuing
just come
on,
out of that. Right.
you had like you mentioned Israel accepts the covenant. There's the
Mhm,
meal they
mhm.
sacrificed, and then they had a covenant meal with Moses at the foot of Sinai and God as well. So that's really well illustrated. It's one of my favorite things about that is not only did they accept, they actually had a meal solidifying the relationship between God and the people of Israel. So they had a fellowship. It's basically a huge fellowship offering, so they could fellowship.
Mhm.
So before getting into Leviticus, where the rules or the instructions for the fellowship offering, the shulamim. So
Right. We'll get into those when we get to Leviticus,
yeah.
because Leviticus is a whole nother level of nerding out. But I want to get to hand this question here. What does the tabernacle
Mhm.
show men and women relationships that echoes to Eden? So can you clarify that a little bit? Are you talking about the relationship between men and women, or the relationship between men and women and God, and as it reflects back to Eden? So I want to get a little clarification on that question first before I answer it, because I don't want to answer the wrong question.
Uh,
So while she's given me some more clarification on that,
mhm.
I want to just kind of jump into just one more thing about sacred spaces, because it's
Mhm.
important with the tabernacle, because
Mhm.
where there is a divine encounter, there is a sacred space created. And that usually requires, and this we'll get into this more when we get into they talk about it here in the instructions for the tabernacle, and then again when we get to this back to the tabernacle at the end of the book. Every time the tabernacle moved, they had to create a new sacred space. So it had to be cleansed. There were
Mhm.
rituals that had to be done. Like, this was an ordeal, but it was also God reclaiming sacred space everywhere they went. So he's walking through foreign deity territory, going, "Yep, that's mine. Yep, that's mine. Yep, that's mine. All these places
Mhm.
belong to me." So he is creating a swath path of holiness. So, um, as he's going. So that's also significant, because that didn't also happen in the ancient world.
Mhm.
You had to rely on the people to go in, take the land away from the other people, and then you could be brought in to claim
And
that
then you could,
territory.
yeah.
Their deities didn't cross into another deity's territory, and then you've got Yahweh marching through everybody's yard going, "I don't care, that's mine now." So
Yeah.
I mean, it's just it's so amazing
I don't
and
care.
crazy.
Love it.
Yeah. All right, the last one, men and women and God. I don't see that interplay in the tabernacle. I see exclusion. Okay. So I
Oh,
think
okay.
that meaning the priesthood, maybe, the
Mhm.
establishment of the priesthood and how that works. So, okay, so we have to kind of go back and remember there are several things at play here. One, this is ancient Near East, and it is a patriarchal world. And um but one of the things we also see when we back up to the 52 instructions that are out come after the 10 commandments, and we're actually the next episode, we're going to talk about the ethics of Torah, and we're going to talk about slavery and women and all, like a lot of this stuff we're going to cover in the next episode. So I'm going to kind of gloss through it quickly, because we're going to deep dive into it next time about how all this works and how all this applies. But what this does, the priesthood is set apart because I think a lot of it has to do with, one, is a patriarchal system. It's a patriarchal world, and that's kind of the way that it functions. So it was assumed, but there was also, and we don't see this until we get to Leviticus really, but there were also women's priest roles. They just couldn't be high priest. So there is
Mhm.
interaction there. Women did things in the temple. They had roles in the tabernacle, and they had roles in the priesthood. It's just not something that is pulled out and brought out, because the ancient Near East mind isn't going to wrestle with this question. You as a person had your place, and that there was a whole lot that was assumed and front loaded into that. It had to do with your tribe, it had to do with your family, it had to, gender was kind of down further on the list of where you were put in your role in society, because women actually were the runners of the household. They ran businesses, they were the, kind of the drivers of family, and men were the drivers of civic things. And so there was a separation there. So it's not it what the tabernacle does is it reunites the harmony between relationships with all of creation within that space. And that's really what the function of it was to do, was to recreate the harmony of Eden, which was together humanity gave back to God out of love and devotion to the blessings that God gave them in a love relationship that was not set in any kind of tension between any of those dynamics. It was meant to be a three-part harmony that would echo the Trinity. Wow, we got an echo of the Trinity baked into Genesis right there. So we're meant to be reflective of the Trinity in this balance of love, respect, and care. So okay, that helped. All right.
Yeah.
So let's move on. We are it really interesting here, when you've got the instructions of all of this, and Moses gets all these instructions. And while he's up getting the instructions, they don't even get out of the first day while Moses is up there getting the instructions, and they break the covenant. Like it's literally, that I want to go into the 40 days thing so bad. We just don't have time to go into the imagery that's going on there, because 40 is, I'm not convinced that's a literal 40 days. Like there's imagery with 40 days of wandering and journeying, and there's a whole bunch there that we just don't have time to get into. But Moses is getting a lot of this stuff, and they've just been given the 10 commandments, 1 and 2. You shall have no other gods before me, and no idols. And what do they do
Literally
while
in
Moses
the face
is up?
too.
Literally,
The Hebrew
and
literally says in the face.
in the face of God. So he's, while God is up there talking to Moses, going through all of this, they're down there going, it's been 5 minutes. They barely get out of the day, and they violate the covenant. They haven't gotten, have you learned? You just want to shake your head and face palm. Like, have you guys learned nothing? Like, what is up with this? And this is where it's really beautiful, because we see in here, God invites Moses into his lament. And there's a lot of debate, Adam, about, did God change his mind? And did Moses change God's mind? And there's this whole, which that's not what's happening here. This is about God inviting Moses as part of relationship to share his grief over the knotheads at the bottom of the mountain that didn't even make it a day and a half before they were already unfaithful. And God is sad. God is grieving. God is, this is them having an affair after a day. They've been married a day and a half, and they're already running off after another God. And God is showing the grief that we are going to see again echoed in the prophets, especially like Ezekiel and Hosea get so graphic with this. It's a repeat. Those are a repeat of what's happening here. And Moses is reminding God, you're in this. Don't forget. But not that God forgets, but just to be reminding him, this is how we lament. And lament brings about restoration if it's done properly. And that's what God and Moses are showing us, how lament can bring about forgiveness and restoration. So God chooses to show mercy to the innocent and punishes the guilty in 34, 6, and 7. He makes that very, very clear that the innocent are spared, but the guilty are the ones who are punished. So moving on, I know we don't have time to stay in that one any longer, but the tabernacle comes back again. If the instructions remind them, by the way, guys, this is why we're here, because God wants to be in the middle of us. And so they you see the tabernacle built. And then in the very end, in chapter 40, Moses can't even go into the tabernacle. It's the craziest thing. You would think Moses, but Moses messed up and Moses can't go into the tabernacle. And that's where we're left going, now what? We've done all this. And now what? We have no access to God because Moses can't even go in. Now what are we going to do? And that brings us to how do we fix it? Which is, I know, Phil's favorite. The book of Leviticus. And I used to be one of those who would just kind of steel myself and get through Leviticus as quickly as possible. And then now I have come to love the book of Leviticus because of guys like Phil and Courtney and Spencer, the rest of the Levitic geek crew. And hopefully we're going to get Why Leviticus Matters Part 2. We had to postpone it again because of stuff, but get that going again because Leviticus matters. It's once you learn how to get through it and see what's going on here, it's such a beautiful book. And it is actually the pinnacle point of the chiasm for the whole book of the five. It all converges in chapter 16 of the Day of the Lord. And the Day of Atonement, not Day of the Lord. Day of Atonement. Good grief. I can't believe I did that. Day of Atonement in 16 and 17, which is the pinnacle of the entire book of the five. Right. But let's just kind of speed through what's going on here, because we could get lost in the weeds of all these instructions that's going on in Leviticus. But we just kind of want to structurally look at, as part of the narrative, what's happening here in Leviticus. So it creates this weird, like, chiastic reverse mirror kind of thing structurally going on here, which I tried to kind of show in this. But so what you've got going on in Leviticus is you have the rituals. It talks about the priests, and then it talks about purity. And then right in the middle, oh, we lost Adam. Hopefully he'll be back. And then right in the middle is the Day of Atonement. So the Day of Atonement kind of shows how you live out these side parts. So the rituals, priests, and purity create the parentheses around how that happens with the Day of Atonement. So you start off with the rituals, which are two types of offerings. There are the grain and fellowship offerings, which are people's way to say thank you back to God. And then there are the burnt purification and restitution offerings, which are man's way of saying I'm sorry. So you got thank you, and then you've got I'm sorry. And then which next we jump into the priests and the establishment of the priesthood. So 8 through 10, Aaron and his sons are ordained. And this is one of the two narratives in the book of Leviticus, the story of Aaron's sons who violate these rules and they're struck dead. So there's two narratives. Thank you, Phil, for pointing this out. This is a Phil nugget. I'm going to side note notation to Phil. He's the one who pointed this out to me because I missed it in reading Leviticus. The story here. And then there's another one on the other side of the Day of Atonement. And then 11 through 15. I think we get Adam back here. All right. Adam's back. I was just walking through the structure here. So I just did the rituals, which are the two offerings. There's the thank you offerings and the I'm sorry offerings, which are the grain offerings and the burnt offerings. And then the establishment of the priesthood, which is one of two narratives in the book of Leviticus, the sons of Aaron violating the rules and getting struck dead by God. So, which is a little shocking, but all of this hinges on, right. But all of this hinges on how Leviticus is showing us that it is so important to understand God's holiness. So, holiness is key to the book of Leviticus, like it says over here on the right side. Holiness is key because God is the creator and he is set apart and unique. And because of that, everything that surrounds God is good and holy. And God's holiness is the essence of life because life comes from God. So holiness is the essence of life. And so that is really important to remember as we're going through all of these. And well, why did God strike these guys dead? And we see in Judges or Samuel, I can't remember. The guy who the ark is sent back after the Ark of the Covenant is taken by the
Samuel.
Philistines, and they send it back, and the on a cart, and the cart hits a bump, and the almost falls off the cart, and what's his name, Uriah or Ureza, the you name guy,
Mhm.
reaches out to steady the ark, and so it won't fall off. And you're like, the guy was just trying to help. He didn't want the ark to fall off,
Mhm.
but he wasn't properly um, prepared to be in contact with the holiness, and he struck dead
Yeah,
because of it.
correct.
And
Yeah.
so understanding holiness is so important to Leviticus, which is where the ritual purity and the moral purity comes in. And there's a lot of emphasis put on that. So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we're kind of having to speed through some of this really good
It's
stuff
all
here,
right.
but we've got videos coming. I've got one video on why Leviticus matters. We got two more
Yeah.
coming eventually, so we get dig really deep into that, so you guys can go check that out to figure out more about Leviticus. But we're talking more about structurally and narratively here, so we don't get to dig
Oh,
into all the fun of the
oh,
of the laws and stuff. So, but we're just kind of
sure.
pointing out, like, we got this weird mirror chiasm kind of thing going here, where you
Mhm.
get the rituals on each side of the Day of Atonement. So you've got the rituals, then you've got the priests and the instructions for the priests, and then you get down to purity and
Yeah.
how those are the parentheses around how all that works, which is the Day of Atonement. And I really want to spend our time focused on the Day of Atonement in the middle, which is why I'm kind of speeding through the rest of it, because
We
Day of
can't talk about the
Atonement,
priesthood
so
and how it
we
reflects
can. I
Genesis
mean,
and creation.
it does,
Leviticus
because
6
we're
through 8.
we're created to be priests. That's our role in
That is true.
creation.
That's another theme. Priesthood is
Yeah.
a theme, and
It's
so
a theme in creation. Like,
yeah,
so
Leviticus
much
6
good stuff.
through 8 is the creation of the priesthood, and it reflects Genesis, the creation account, the 7 days. Although it says 8 in Leviticus because the eighth day is when
Mhm.
their priesthood starts. So I just like the fact that it echoes creation, the 7 days of creation, um, in that aspect. But yeah, absolutely. I think you see the priesthood in Exodus 19, where we are that royal
Mhm.
priesthood that's echoed in the New Testament, especially in Revelation.
Yep.
Um, and then you get Adam and Eve being they're supposed to be a priest and a priestess as well. So
Mhm.
that's all. We can move on to the holiness code or day of the
Okay, yeah. Well,
day.
I think because I want to touch on the purity stuff really quickly, because you got the mirror of the rituals in 1 through 7 is mirrored in the rituals, which is the going through the feast days, the 7 feast days,
Hmm.
uh, at the end of towards the end of the book there. So those are the beginning and the end, and that's the how. This is the instructions for how we do these things, and then the priests come next with 8 through 10 and 21 through 22, and that's the who. So who is the
Hmm.
one that's helping us do these things? And then you get to the important, not important, but the why. So because purity, because why? Holiness matters. So I want to talk about the difference between ritual purity and moral purity, because there's a bit of a difference here. So ritual purity in the instructions in 11 through 15, loss of life was ritually impure because death is the opposite of life, which is the opposite of
Hmm.
holiness. And that taint of death can't be in the presence of holiness. So being ritually impure is not sinful. It is not something that is punitive. It isn't something that is one of those thou shalt nots. It
Correct.
just means you have come in contact with something that carries the taint of death. But this was normal, and it was a part of
Mhm.
everyday life, and it was temporary, which is why you don't see very many instructions that send you to the temple or the tabernacle to sacrifice or offer something. You could, most of the time it was take a bath, go to bed, wake up, and you're okay
You're
after
good. Yeah.
a period of time, and you're good, because it was
Mhm.
not sin technically, which is missing the mark. It was a natural rhythm of life that contained something that was connected to death, which cannot be in the presence of holiness. Pure and simple. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than that when we go through and read that section. And then you get the part of moral purity in 18 and through 20. And that is set in a framework of moral purity is the standard for how do we live differently, because Israel has been pulled out to live different from the nations around it, because that is supposed to be the shining light of life to draw the rest of the world in to Israel. So they're morally pure by living differently through a few things. One, care for the poor is a huge way that we are morally different than the rest of the nations around. Sexual integrity is very different in Israel than it is in the rest of the ancient Near East world around them. And social justice. These are radical. So Adam, give us like a 3-minute overview of how radically different this part of Leviticus makes Israel.
It again, I think I've said this before, but it didn't really exist in the surrounding cultures. They had instructions and everything based on human wisdom or how to live rightly, so to speak. But it really didn't revolve around holiness at all. They didn't really have the idea of image bearers, as Dr. Imes so lovingly put it. Um, it just didn't exist. Whereas in this context, in the context of instructions in Leviticus, it does exist. It's like, okay, if God is holy and perfect, Leviticus 16 through 26 or 7, depending on how you view how long the holiness code is, this teaches you how to live, to be image bearers, essentially. It teaches you how to live a holy life. In when trying to word this here, it teaches you how to live a holy life when not so much confronted with God, but living in His presence. So, as far as the ancient Near East is concerned, it just didn't exist. It was all about, it was a beneficial relationship. It was a symbiotic relationship. That's the word I'm thinking of. It was a symbiotic relationship. Is what can I get out of this relationship, and what do the gods get out of this relationship? So that was non-existent in Leviticus. It was all about holy living, which again didn't exist that outside. So
Right. I think it's really important to understand this pulled outness, and holiness is why. And because they're pulled out, they're supposed to be holy, because that light again, and that difference is supposed to make the nations around see the blessing, see the light of this holiness shining out of Israel, and say, I don't know what that is, but I want that. And to join
exactly.
in and to come into covenant, because the covenant was meant to be like, just like Eden, it was meant to be spread over all of the earth.
Yeah.
And so it was not meant to be exclusive to just little territory. It's
Right.
meant to
Yeah.
go everywhere.
They were
Right.
supposed to be a beacon to
Right.
the nations. Yep.
Right. Which brings us to the middle of Leviticus and the chiastic point of the Pentateuch, which is the Day of Atonement. And this is one of those things that causes a lot of arguments around a lot of different people. And because there's some understandings of how this works. And so, Adam, we're going to we're going to just kind of go through the way that the Hebrew mind would understand this. And it might
Okay.
be something some people disagree with, which is okay,
Okay.
because we're
Yeah.
going to do this the ancient Near Eastern way. And if people have differences of opinion, that's perfectly okay with them. I'm okay with that. But we're going to do it the way that it's laid out here. So the Day of Atonement basically is an annual, think about it as an annual reset for Israel. So every year, Israel needed a purity reset. The tabernacle needed cleansed every year, and every year the annual collection of the sins and the residue of the sins and the dimming of the holiness of the camp had to be reset. on a corporate level, on a people-wide big level. So it wasn't as concerned with the individual person, because there's a whole bunch of purity things that are happening with the rituals and the offerings that are going on dealing with the individual. Day of Atonement is big picture corporate Israel overview. Reset, it cleanses the tabernacle. So what's happening here is 2 goats are brought to the high priest during this feast day, because this is a feast day. So during this feast, 2 goats are brought to before the high priest. And in this, so you get 2 goats, and they cast lots, or however they, rock, paper, scissors, however they decide which goat is going to be which. And one goat is slaughtered. Oh, looks like Adam's having some issues here again. We lost him. Hopefully he'll be back. So one goat is slaughtered, and the blood is collected, and that blood is taken, and the blood is sprinkled. And what that does is it cleanses the space. It cleanses the tabernacle. It cleanses the temple. It cleanses the gathering space so that God can come and meet with his people. And that's what that goat does. It cleanses the space. End of story. Now we go to the second goat. And what happens with that second goat is really, really interesting, because what you see is the high priest will put his hands on that second goat. And what that does is, if you think about like an imagery from those of us who grew up. Okay, we were just jumping into the second goat, because I just finished talking about how the first goat was killed, and then that blood was taken, and the purpose of that first goat was to cleanse the space for God to be able to come back to the tabernacle or temple and meet with his people. That was the purpose of the first goat, was cleansing the space. That was it. That's what it did.
All
Okay.
was that, and a representation of life.
Right. It was the restoring of life. Yeah.
Correct.
Which is where holiness is the thing that comes from. So it's this really beautiful image. And then we're getting ready to go to the second goat. So the second goat is brought in front of the high priest. The high priest lays hands on the goat, and people get this idea of this like transfer or whatever thing. So I was just getting ready to talk about how, if we go back and we think about images from like the gold rush days, and you've got those pack mules that have got all those bags and everything on them, and you take that and that carries your supplies with you. That's more kind of an idea of what's happening with that second goat. The weight of the sin guilt of Israel, the people collective, is put on that second goat, weighted like a pack mule. So they load all those bags, all that baggage of all that weight of all that sin guilt, put it on that second goat, and send it out to the wilderness. And it goes out to, and sent out to, and then you get into some really interesting debates about Azazel and what that is and what that means. And I think that's just simply that weight of that sin is sent back to where it belongs. It is sent back to the evil that created. Yes, it's sent back to the profane space that created it in the first place, that we will see the final eschaton going to deal with the collective weight of the sin burden that was created on humanity. And that's where that second goat sent the weight of that sin guilt. And so it's as simple as that.
That's pretty much it. So the second goat just goes into profane space, and the temple's cleansed, and then there's this representation, or if I could say that, re-representation of a life back to God, and then God's able to descend again and then dwell among his people.
So, Adam, this is where we're going to get in a little bit of trouble. You ready for this? Was there suffering and torture involved in atonement?
No. The instructions have explicit and strict rules about how to perform these ritualistic sacrifices. All of them are ritualistic in nature. If you just wanted to eat, now this is strictly in Leviticus. We haven't gotten to the fifth book. So they had strict rules about sacrifice, and if you just wanted to eat, you couldn't just kill an animal because you were cut off immediately if you just
Mm-hmm.
that's just if you just killed an animal. If you wanted to eat, you had to go through a ritualistic process and then present that animal to the
Mm-hmm.
tabernacle, and then you could either eat. It could be used as a fellowship offering, or you could just eat. I think it was either or. Um, and that's how it was. It was just you just there were oh yeah, now one was uh, in order to do that in order to ritualistic kill an animal, you had to make sure the animal did not suffer in any sort of way. So
Mm-hmm.
there was even instructions on how to make it quick
Mm-hmm.
so that the animal did not suffer. And then again, you presented that back to life, or presented that back to God as a representation of life, and then you could actually eat. Or it was like in the cases of sin offerings and the other offerings, it operated a bit differently. But for this particular thing I'm talking about now, I have the fellowship offering in mind, or
Mm-hmm.
just eating in general. So there was really no suffering. There was none of that.
Mm-hmm.
There was no wrath. There was no suffering or anything like that at all.
Right. Well, and I'm going to go so far as to say, because if the instructions, especially when you get to Deuteronomy, the instructions are so specific, and the person bringing that
Mm.
offering is the one who was handed the sacrificial knife to do the killing
Yeah,
themselves, and then
they
the
had
priest,
to,
the butchers who broke that sacrifice down. But if that animal suffered, that tainted that animal, and it was no longer able to be sacrificed. And so, if
yep,
the animal suffered, that was tainted and was not able to be a sacrifice. You couldn't, for a either kind of offering, either for an
yep.
atonement or a non-atonement offering, either one, suffering would taint the animal and make it ineligible to suffer.
And there was
So,
a whole book, like one of the
mhm,
minor prophets. The whole book was about offering blemished,
mhm,
tainted Malachi.
right,
Like,
right.
so
So
puts it
the
in
idea that
perspective.
any kind of thing that was offered to God in atonement that was forced through suffering and torture as part of the process, I don't think that holds up according to the Old Testament system.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
Not at
All
all.
right. So we beat that horse enough. We don't need to keep hammering
It's
on
good,
that.
Jim.
But that one's pretty much dead as far as I'm concerned. So we end up the book of Leviticus. If you've made it all the way through this far to Leviticus, we end up at the end in chapters 26 and 27 with a call to covenant faithfulness. And this really beautiful picture. Obedience brings peace and abundance, but unfaithfulness is going to bring disaster and exile. So they are warned at the end of Leviticus, choose life or choose death. Here we are with the choice
Hmm.
once again. Every book seems to setting us up with this choice of choose life or choose death. It's really amazing how we do that. So now we get to jump into the book of genealogy. No, the book of
Numbers.
Numbers. I have a growing appreciation for the book of Numbers. It's hard to get stuck on the genealogies at the beginning.
Yeah. My thing with numbers, I was in the same boat. I wasn't really fascinated with numbers until I started learning the Exodus when you get the itinerary from
Mm,
numbers 10 to 33, where it explicitly lists the journey of the Exodus.
mhm. Oh, yeah, it
And
does.
then,
It's
you
really
got the
crazy.
place names and everything. That's when I
Mhm.
got interested in numbers. And then I
Yeah,
realized there was a
cosmic
lot more
geography.
to the book than just that.
Right. So we're going to jump in briefly and do the book of Numbers here. So Numbers is this tale of God's faithfulness versus Israel's rebellion. And that is not only a biblical theology theme that runs Genesis to Revelation, this is played out graphically in the book of Numbers. So,
Mhm.
let's kind of I've got like I said, but as part of my master's and hopefully dissertation work, Numbers is going to become extremely important to what I'm going to be doing, especially the layout of the camp and the first four chapters there. So I'm starting to get intimately and acquainted with this book, and I'm starting to fall in love with it a lot. So we start out with a census and accounting of the people, and nobody likes to read genealogies, including your own. So it's really kind of tough to get through all these people and all of this stuff, but there's so much good stuff to unpack in those names, and we don't have time to do that, unfortunately. But the first 4 chapters give us a census and accounting of the people. They need to know basically how many there are, and these are not exact counts because, the ancient Near East kind of plays a little fast and loose with estimations of numbers, and they usually will round up generously in the representations of them. So we won't need to go into that any more than that. And then you get this meticulous layout of the camp, of how you have the tabernacle in the middle, and then you've got the ring of the priests and the other ones who are the servants in the temple. And then there's a very specific layout for which tribes go where in this big X shape that juts out tabernacle. So you got a wing to the east, a wing to the west, a wing to the north, and a wing to the south. So you've got the camp laid out very specifically. And then everything outside the camp is considered non-sacred space. So everything inside the camp has to be clean. This is where the Pritchett, okay, good grief. The Puritan. I've been spending any much time hanging out with those guys on Biblical Rogues Gallery
He's
lately.
not going to let you live that one down.
No, he's not. He's not. Yeah, somebody's going to clip that and send it to Pritchett, I'm sure. Anyway, so the purity rituals are very important here because inside the camp has to stay sacred space. And then outside the camp, that's where like garbage is, people, outhouses, like all the unclean stuff happens outside the camp. Foreigners have to stay outside the camp. Like there's reasons and layers into all of this layout of the camp, which is going to be part of my thesis work. So that's going to be fun to do. But anyway, right now it's all about ritual purity, and it's about making the camp ritually pure so God can continue to dwell amongst his people, because we're going on a road trip. Guess what we're doing? Numbers is a road trip. So if you like road trips, the book of Numbers is for you. So they set all this stuff up in the first 10 chapters of how to set up the camp, all the rules, all the purity stuff, everything we need to know here. And then we set out on our first journey in the second half of chapter 10 through chapter 12, and it goes badly. It does. It goes, it just,
a little bit.
Israel seems to love to show us how fast to make things go off the rails. It it makes me feel better about some of my own life choices, because I'm like, well, that wasn't quite that dumb yet. Like
I didn't do that. Didn't do that.
That's right. Yeah. It's a whole list of how things can go wrong.
I know we're not supposed to do that, but
right.
I know we're not supposed to compare, but
so they go wandering, which bridges us to the next section, which is 13 through 19. And we're in the wilderness of Paran here. And so this is getting to the edge of where the promised land is. And in 13 and 14, one of everybody's favorite Sunday school stories, and the 12 spies, and they send them out and they go scout out the land and bring back reports. And 10 of them say, thumbs down, this is too bad, we can't do this. And 2 of them, Caleb and Joshua, who are the only 2 whose names are preserved, which I love that too. The faithful are preserved. It's a beautiful thing. So Caleb and Joshua say, yes, we can do it. God's with us. We can do it. And things go badly again. Moses intervenes with God again, because God is like, I'm fed up with these people. They're driving me crazy. And Moses sits, and God invites him to lament and intervenes again. And they have another conversation. And God relents and gives them another chance. And then we get the fabulous story. So, Adam, let's tell us a little bit about the rebellion of Korah, because this is not one of their better, more shining moments.
No, it really isn't. So Korah gets rather jealous that Moses is making all the decisions, and he earns a following, and then he sort of rebels. Now, historically, if I can here,
Mhm.
historically, there's a bit of a theory that the Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer has put forward, along with the recent um, Kenneth Kitchen, who
Mhm.
went to be with the Lord about a month ago.
Mm.
Um, they had this theory that there were some Egyptian priests that came along with them, as far as Korah in Hebrew means bald.
Mm.
So there's some sort of connection. There might be some sort of connection there because the Egyptian priests were bald as well. They'd shave ritualistically, shave their entire bodies. Again, it goes back to purity laws, which did exist in the ancient Near East. But um, so there's a theory here that these were some Egyptian priests who wanted a role in the priesthood but didn't get it. So they rebelled against him because Moses was intervening, or was the only one talking to God, along with Joshua, whom God handpicked. Of course, that we'll get into that later again. So that's what's going on here with the rebellion of Korah in a nutshell.
But then it gets a little funky because the ground opens up and a whole tribe gets
Yep,
swallowed, a whole clan gets
swallowed.
swallowed. And we can look at that and we can go, wow, God's mean. Like, what has happened
Mhm.
there? Like, a whole bunch of people died there. But if we back up a
That's
little
one
bit and we
thing.
look at the need for holiness, and that these kind of rebellions are a contagion that infect the entire community and threaten the entire community. There are certain things that
Right.
God cannot and will not tolerate. And the preservation of the community is the most important thing. And so those things have to be dealt with. So there's very few things in the Old Testament, which I think is a misunderstanding. There are very few things that are a drop dead punishment instantly, but they all have to do with the violation and desecration of the holiness of God,
Yeah.
which is what's happening here when they're rebelling to try to overthrow God's appointed leadership. It's a violation of holy space, and that cannot be allowed.
It cannot happen. Yep.
And so it goes badly for, and that's one of those things that is part of that generational, I don't want to say generational curse, because I think that gets a little misunderstood there, but it's a generational tradition that will get passed down. And so that family has to be removed because they
Mm.
don't want that family tradition of rebellion to continue. So
So I think
it's
that was
it's
what happened
horrible and
before.
tragic.
Yeah. I think that's what happened with the clan of Korah as well. Is that
Mhm.
the whole clan was, and again, it's a precursor of what happens to Achan and his clan and Judges 7, or not Judges, Joshua 7.
Yeah.
So you see that again. We'll see that again later on.
Mhm.
If you know your Old Testament. So
Yeah, and so there's this is another pattern when the community
mhm.
and the holiness is threatened, that it has to be immediately removed. And it's drastic, and it is shocking to us if we don't quite understand the context that's happening there. So after that, they pick up and we go back to wandering again, and things
Mhm.
go badly again in 20 and 21. Israel just is such a beautiful example of how humans just cannot keep it together. We just can't. People cannot.
Nope.
We just can't do it. So then we get into the plains of Moab. I mean, I wish we had time to get into Moab because there's so much cool stuff going on in
Yeah,
Moab throughout the entire thing. But
that's for
one of
sure.
everybody's favorite stories of Balaam and the talking donkey that's going on
Mhm.
here, and the king of Moab, that he's trying to curse Israel. So he gets Balaam to come and bring a curse on Israel. And Balaam is not Jewish. He's not
Mm.
Israelite. And and he's like, he knows enough about Yahweh to say, nope, not gonna do
I'm
it.
not doing it.
Nope. And it
That
finally
fear
gets
was
him.
there
Yeah.
too,
Yeah.
because he
And he
knew they
finally
knew about
goes.
the
Yeah.
Exodus. So
Mhm. Right. Well, Yahweh's reputation is spreading, which is
mhm.
where representing God's name well is important because God's reputation is spreading. And in this context, they understand the bigger spiritual implications of that. And so Balaam's like, I don't want to mess with that deity. Look what he did. So he finally gets talked into it, and the angel goes to wipe him out. And then Balaam is like, donkey is like, hey, you don't want to do that. And poor Balaam's donkey, that just doesn't go well for him either. But and then you get the rest of that story, and every time he goes to the king of Moab's like, curse them, and Balaam opens his mouth and out comes a blessing. And the king of Moab is getting madder and madder because he's like, I brought you to curse. What are you doing? And Balaam's like, sorry, your God is scarier than you. So I'm not going to do that. So there's that whole beautiful thing. And then that prepares us in the end of that section of the plains of Moab, prepares us for the next generation to enter the land, because the exile generation at this point is so hard and tainted that God says you just can't go in. And so that's when we see this, like, they all have to die off. At the next generation, we're going to start over. So God is not giving up and abandoning his covenant promises, but he does have to do a reset. So we get this bigger, almost echo of the Day of Atonement happening here, because he has to reset with a whole new group, with a whole new beginning, a whole new, we have to decreate. Now we're recreating again with a whole new group and a whole new batch of people. So, which takes us into my favorite, the book of Deuteronomy. I love Deuteronomy. So when you're reading Deuteronomy, next time you guys read the book of Deuteronomy, I want you to start by thinking, this is a love letter from God. The book of Deuteronomy is a love letter from God. That's what it is. And it's also a collection of the last 2 sermons of Moses, is what we've got going on here, with a whole bunch of Torah instructions stuck in the middle. So you've got a sermon by Moses, or a collection of sermons. There's some debate about that, but basically it's a big long sermon of Moses, a whole bunch of instructions, and then his sermon there at the end. So we're gonna again speed through this because it's getting long. So we don't want to keep going forever and ever. But so we start chapters 1 through 3. Moses sums up the story of what's happened in the 4 books that we've just gone through. And then he calls everyone to faithful adherence to the covenant in 4 through 11. And I'm speeding through that because I want to get to this next one, because the Shema is massively important. It's important to Deuteronomy. It's important to the history of Israel. And it's important to the New Testament and to us now. I think it is. I go back to the Shema a lot when I'm talking about trying to understand a whole lot of things, because it really is this important thing of the Shema is a liturgy, is what it is. It's a liturgy for Israel to contemplate how to love God alone and to obey the instructions by incorporating them into every minute of their lives. So, I just want to kind of sit there for just a second, and then we'll get to the part that I asked you about, Adam. But this idea that this is liturgy, because in the way that Hebrew and the Hebrew mind think, in quotation marks, right? Because I think that all languages and cultures have a way of thinking, right? But this is cyclical, and it's contemplative, and it's metaphoric, and it is meant for you to spend time thinking about it, praying about it, living in it, experiencing it in a way that continues to grow this relationship with God, in a way that saturates it into every fiber of your life, your day, your breathing, your existence, your thought, everything. And that's what this prayer in the Shema really focuses them in on. This is like the most condensed version of the point of Torah, is right here in the Shema. And it talks about that you're supposed to love God with all, and it's translated heart, mind, and strength. But those Hebrew words there are so much bigger. So let's take like 5 minutes and talk about how big those words actually are, because we spent a lot of time in Hebrew talking about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, traditionally, if you look up the word for heart in Hebrew, it's going to be lev or
Mhm,
levav. There are two different ways to do it. But yeah, like you said, it goes much deeper than that. They're they occur quite a lot in the Old Testament, and they do have some sort of theological importance. Um, Becoming intelligent, or it can mean the verb. There's even a verb form for it, so you can heart something, and usually it's translated as to become intelligent or to fascinate.
mhm.
In that sort of way, there are a couple of instances in the Book of Job and the Song of Songs where it's translated like that. But here specifically, usually the heart is also the seat of, where was it? I just saw it. Oh, here. It is the chest, or it can also be conscience. So
Mhm.
these words have a dominant metaphorical use in reference to the center of human psychical, I cannot
Mhm.
pronounce this word, but psychical, something like that, and spiritual
Cyclical, yeah,
life
yeah.
to the to the inner life of the person. So
Mhm.
it penetrates us. Um, what else? That's probably
Okay,
one of my
yeah.
favorites.
So, would you
It,
say, Adam, that that word is conveying the center of our personness, the thing that makes us a person is this word heart here?
I would say, yeah, I would say it's the centerpiece in us. It's the, I don't want to say the mind, because the mind's the a
Mhm.
different word,
That's a different
but
word.
yeah, but it's like you said, yeah, I would say it's the center. It's
Mhm.
definitely the center of us.
Right, okay, so the next word happens to be translated mind, which is
Um, oh wait, I got the
what's the
wrong.
next one?
Um, you said
I can't
mind?
have this. Or which yeah,
I'm
what's the
confused.
next
I got
word
them all
that
here.
it's heart,
I think I
mind, and strength are the way they're translated,
Yes.
um,
So I
in
got the
that
words
order,
mixed.
so
No, we're good. I have,
okay.
for some reason, life. Um, I
Oh,
thought I had this up. Now I got I think I highlighted the wrong. I got ma'od, which means strength and power, which
okay,
I
that's
think
the
is
3rd word. Yeah.
traditionally, you know what, what's messing up? I had the Hallett up,
Oh,
and I
Hallett, yep.
didn't mean to have that one up.
You and
Oh,
you
wait,
and I
hold
have
on. Give me
thoughts
one
about
second, because
Hallett.
I had all three of these up. So ma'od, okay, I found it. So the words
Yes,
ma'od,
uh-oh. Yeah.
um, it can mean strength and power, of course, as it often is, but there's a little more to the word,
Mhm,
and it's total commitment. That is,
mhm,
it's total commitment to the love of God. So the Israelites were instructed to love God, excuse me, again with all their heart, or will. Will's another word that could be
mhm,
translated with levav or lev, with all their essence
mhm,
and with all their might.
mhm,
So the love commanded here certainly involves fear, reverence, obedience, loyalty, and service. And the worshipers are given, or at least us, those who follow God, Yahweh, are commanded to give their ultimate and full allegiance and loyalty. So
mhm,
ma'od could also be translated as loyalty to the one who alone makes human life possible, um, God Himself. And the love required by this injunction, ma'od, is not just mere obedience, but that it's deeply affectionate loyalty. So it certainly goes
mhm.
beyond mere strength and power and might.
Right, and I think Dr. Jossberger in Hebrew, when we were talking we spent an entire day on this on these 3 words when we were doing the Shema, and she talked
Yeah.
about, like, that this word here that's translated, like, as strength, it's just that thing, that umption that propels us
Hmm.
into deeper, moving forward in love of God, moving forward in commitment to relationship with God. Like it's this almost this propelling force that causes action is kind of the idea that she was talking about, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. It's not like
Yeah.
I'm gonna muscle my way through this. It's that inner thing that
Yep.
undefinably propels us forward kind of idea.
And the final one is nefesh, which means
Nefesh.
simply, it can simply mean life, but there's a lot more to nefesh than that as well. Even in the cognate languages
Mhm,
like Akkadian, the word is nefishtum, which is
mhm,
the cognate for nefesh, and it's literate the definition for that word in Akkadian is huge. So in Hebrew, it shouldn't come as a surprise that it goes deeper than just
Mhm,
life. It can also mean breath.
mhm.
Um, what else? I got pages of this. Like it's crazy. It
Nefesh
can
is
be
really
living
cool.
being. So it can be living being, which in the case of the Shema, it means we are to love God
Mhm,
with our whole living being, our whole self.
mhm.
Um, um,
So, yeah,
it can
basically, I
also
think
mean
go ahead.
I was going to add, it's also a synonym for the inner person as well, like Lev,
Mhm,
the inner person that dwells within us, or the entire individual. It also represents the desires and inclinations of humans and animals, and the panting breath that is associated with the intense desire. The reason
mhm,
it can be synonymous with the word nefesh,
mhm.
as far or lev, as far as the inner person's concerned.
Right. So basically what you've got here with these 3 words, there we go with the number 3 again, but it
Right.
is when these 3 words are put together, this is a reflection of the totality. We're supposed to be all
Mhm.
in,
Oh,
100% in
and you
this
got the
in this relationship. Like
and you got the
everything we
quantifier
do.
there, kol,
Yeah.
which means
Yep.
all or entirety. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, so
Complete.
this is like there is no reservations here. You're supposed to go full in hardcore. This is the CrossFit of relationship here. Like we're supposed to be 100% in, full throttle in relationship with God here. So that's what's going on with these 3. So it's so much more beautiful than just the simple English reduction to one word translation. I think
Yeah.
that gets missed, and why that's so important, because when you're 100% of yourself is saturated in stewing and contemplating living in relationship with God in every waking minute of your day. That's why I think the Shema is a liturgy, because that's what it does is it sucks in from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep. Your whole entire
Mhm.
day is covered in thinking about the Shema. So that's why I wanted to spend a few minutes on this, because it's so important that everything we do is supposed to be saturated in God. That's supposed to saturate us. It's 100% all in all the way around, because God's
Right.
going to show up 100% as well, which is what we learn in this contemplation of this idea. So yeah, I love this. I
Buddy.
love this. Oh, it's great. It's good stuff. All right. Then we get
Yeah.
into the middle, which is a whole bunch more of Moses is going back and saying, all right, we got all these Torah instructions, and I'm going to pull these out and I'm going to organize them, and I'm going to tell you what you need to know. And this is what we're going to do. And funny enough, Adam, this has really struck me when I was pulling this together. We
Mhm.
start with worship. Isn't that a
Oh,
crazy and amazing? I,
yeah.
I
Who
know.
knew? Who
I know.
knew?
Who knew? The most important thing, we start with worship. And that happens at the temple or the tabernacle, because we haven't gotten the
Mhm.
tabernacle yet, or the temple yet. So at the tabernacle, or later it becomes temple. And by what? Alms giving to the poor. So
Mhm.
we get, and then we give out of our overflow. And the giving of our overflow is worship. And that to me was a piece that I've just recently started engaging with, the idea of this almsgiving as part of worship. Like, you hear when they're passing the plate around, like, this is part of your worship. Like, just throw some things in there. But
A little more.
alms to the poor is bigger than that.
Mhm.
Like, if you think about, that's giving somebody a space to sleep if they're in need. Almsgiving is, you can even, there's some traditions, which I really love this. There's some traditions, and I think this would work in the ancient context too. And I would love to get your thoughts on this really quickly, Adam, too, that
Mhm.
that even the sharing of wisdom and the sharing of learning and the sharing of experience is almsgiving. So if I don't know about something that I need to learn about, and you know about that, and you share that with me, you're giving out of your abundance of knowledge, and I am receiving out of my lack of knowledge. And that is part of the almsgiving as well. That is something that we can do in participating in worship by helping to encourage and educate each other and to giving to those who are in lack, however that is, emotionally, spiritually, physically. Like, it covers so many things. So does this check out with the ancient Near East idea of care for community?
Uh,
Kind of put you on the spot there with that one.
it was like it wasn't that dark. I mean, it was dark because there was Yahweh wasn't present in their lives, but there was a sense of community as well in the ancient Near East. At that level, though, probably not. But there was a sense of community. There was a sense of togetherness in Mesopotamia and Egypt, because that's just, I think that was a culture context thing as well. So that there was togetherness and there was a sense of community at the lay level, in particular. So and I think I said this before, but as far as the instructions are concerned with the law codes of Hammurabi, the Ashnuna laws and everything, those were usually set up in the palaces. So your average Joe Schmo didn't even get to see probably the law of Hammurabi or the code of Hammurabi, which were the same thing. Their instructions as well, but and then the court documents, so court dockets. So they operate on a different system
Yep.
than maybe, the LH or the CH, however you want to call the code of Hammurabi. So, but here it's deeper than it was out there without the presence of God. So you didn't have the giving to the alms. It was suggested, I would say, but it certainly wasn't defined on terms like by giving to the poor. Like, we're told to worship and give to the poor, give alms. I think next right there, you got the character of leaders. They didn't really
Yep.
care about the character of leaders in the ancient Near East. I mean, the law of Hammurabi was literally justification of the king, of the reign of the king, or the king justification for the king in sight of the god of justice, Shamash.
Yep.
So that's all absent here, because we're called to live a holy life out of Leviticus, and then here we're called to worship and give to the alms, or give alms to the poor. So,
Right. And leaders are held accountable, which is
and
is
leaders are held
again
accountable.
unheard of. And
Yeah.
Torah holds them accountable. And then that's where the prophets come in. The prophets come in when a leader is out of line. A prophet is sent to confront them and say, hey, you're out of line. And that there is an accountability system that is unique again to Israel that we don't see in any other nation around them, which I can just imagine. I mean, I can't even imagine really, but understanding just the little bit that I do, how how um how different and appealing that would be to the nations around, where the king can't come in, or the king's officials can't come in and just dispossess me off my land, take everything that I own, can't just
Yeah.
take whatever they want and get away with whatever they want and stealing wealth and women and all this other things that are happening. They can't get away with that because Torah
Mhm.
holds them to a higher standard, and the prophets come and call them out when it's violated. So, you
Yeah.
know, it's just again, it's just it was so revolutionary
And
for its
I
context.
don't
It's amazing.
I don't want to misrepresent. They had wisdom literature in the ancient Near East,
Yeah,
like the maxims of
right.
Tahotep, I think is what it is. So they had wisdom literature in the ancient Near East, but
Mhm,
when it's compared against the backdrop of, say, Deuteronomy here, since it's what the book
mhm,
we're in right now, it's incomparable. I think so.
mhm. Yeah, it's just something that they would have not, you know, but it was intentional for God to make them they were supposed to be so different that people
Hmm.
wanted the blessings that came from being held to such a high standard of holiness. That they,
Yeah.
they were blessed. So then in 19 to 26, you've got a whole bunch of civic and social instructions for marriage and family and business, protection of widows and orphans and immigrants. I mean, this is the civil code of how they're supposed to interact with their neighbor. This is really into the nitty-gritty of how to care for their neighbor. And then it winds up with another short section there on worship. So this whole collection of instructions starts and ends in worship, which is reflective of their day, which started and ended with the Shema and with worship. It was really interesting. So then we get to Moses's last sermon, and he
Mhm.
starts giving them a warning and an ultimatum in 27 through 30. And this is again where we see every book that we've been through sets them up. Choose obedience and life, or choose rebellion and death, which is a repeat of Genesis 3 and the fall in Adam and Eve. They were given the same
Mhm.
thing: choose obedience and choose life, or choose disobedience and choose death. And they made the wrong choice. And again and again and again, we are given the choice: make the right choice, choose obedience and choose life, or, make the wrong choice, choose disobedience, and then you choose the consequences that come with that.
Yeah.
Right? But Moses gives them hope that even though they will go to exile, because he's like, y'all dumb, you don't learn, you're going to end up in exile, right? And because he knows he's been with these people for, been wandering around in the wilderness for them for 40 years. It's been even longer since they've been coming out with the Exodus. So he's been with these guys 2 generations now. And if you've been in relationship with somebody for that long, you just know, you know,
Yeah.
you've been in a relationship with somebody for a while, and you've been married, you start getting married up into the decades, and decades start adding up into multiple decades. My husband and I have been married over 20 years now. So I have a pretty good idea of what he's going to do. I'm not right
Yeah.
100% of the time, but I have a pretty good gauge of how he's going to react to stuff, just because we've been around each other for such a long time. Right. And so that's
Yeah.
kind of what's going on here. Moses is like, listen, y'all are hard-headed, hard-hearted. You don't learn. And if you don't change your ways, you're going to end up kicked out of this land that you're getting. And while you're there, which is really fun because the language flips to while you're in exile. So this is prophecy that's happening now. So
Yeah.
when you get thrown out and you're in exile, at any point you can come back to God, which I
Really?
love. You get this building of the theme that we're going to see in the prophets of shuv, of turn, return, which
Yes.
is massive in the prophets. Like they go crazy with that. But you get this promise, even though the prophecy of them getting thrown out, you get the promise of return. So the problem is the hard heart. And this
Which
is
we
at
get
the
in Exodus
end,
too.
right? And you see it all the
And
way through. And it's, the battle of Pharaoh that keeps happening over and over and over and over, individually, nationally, every so just for Troy, this is a fractal pattern all the way up, all the way down. We see this battle of back and forth, hardness of heart. And it's a it's it I love this whole, yeah. So Moses promises them here at the end of Deuteronomy, someone is coming to give them a new heart. While you're in exile, think about this. Not only do you get to come back, but you get to come back. Why? Because someone is coming to give you a new heart.
Mhm.
When the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Torah, the first 5, ends with the hope that someone is coming to fix it so we can stay in relationship with God forever.
Yeah,
And
it's
that is
very
where we are
quite an
left.
ending.
And what an ending
Yeah.
that is. Because all the rest of these books we've been left with, now what? Like, is there hope because we keep messing up and we're left in this
Yeah.
dark spot? Is there hope? And the next book starts with, yep, there's hope. But this one,
Yehoshua, yeah, which means salvation.
yeah, this one sets us
So,
up for Joshua. And it's the same name in Hebrew that Jesus has, which is,
yeah,
I love that it's just this picture and this beautiful thing that sets us up for the one who's coming. And we get into, and that could be a whole nother rabbit hole that we'll have to go down on another day because we're at 2 hours and it's been a long time.
we
And so
are.
we're all getting
That's how you,
the brainiacs are running out of brain power here. So, so
yeah, that's for
thank
sure.
you, Adam. So
Yeah,
this has been so much fun. I love this. This is
this
this
was
is the
good.
kind of stuff that we can just nerd out on this for days and days and days. But
Days and
thank you
days.
for
Yep.
coming. Next
My
time,
pleasure.
hopefully next week, but next time we're going to get into the ethics of Torah. We're going to talk about slavery. We're going to talk about women. We're going to talk about polygamy. We're going to talk about all of that and how all that applies, and does it apply to us? And then the episode after that, hopefully Courtney will be joining us for which part of Torah do we have to comply with, and should we be Torah compliant or not? Which parts do we follow? Which parts don't we? It's going to be a blast. And then our last one is going to wrap up with Jesus and Torah. Where do we find Jesus in Torah? How does all that work? Like, we're going to get deep into Christophanies. And so get your, that'll be a Christology episode. We're going to brush up on our Christology and our Christophanies, talk about all that stuff. So that'll be a lot of fun too. So Adam, wrapping up here, one final takeaway thought, and then to give us kind of a recap. Where can we find you? What's coming up on your channel? Kind of thing.
Absolutely. One of my favorite things about Torah is usually found in the. I found this out recently. I thought it was beautiful too. Was the in Genesis 4, you get the struggle between Cain and Abel, and he asks a pertinent question to God: "Am I my brother's keeper?" So you have that question in Genesis that goes unanswered throughout the entire book until the end, and I'll get there in a second. But you have Cain and Abel. There's a sibling rivalry is another theme in Genesis, and you see that with Cain and Abel. You see that with Jacob and Esau. You see that with the brothers themselves, all 12. And at the end, the writer of Genesis answers that question from Genesis 4. Am I my brother's keeper? And the answer is yes, you are, because Joseph kept brothers. Yeah, it's all right. Kept his brothers. Like, when I mean keep, I mean like, that's another word that's really hard to translate in English because we don't say it that way very much anymore. Am I supposed to protect or love my brother, basically? And the answer is, well, yes, you are. So that's my one takeaway for Genesis. I found that out recently and it blew my mind. And it was there. It's like, geez, it was there the whole time anyway.
Right.
Like, the light bulb came on. So yeah, to find me, you can find me. It's going to be Linguas Amo is my name of my channel. I nerd out on Old Testament stuff like Amber does. I'm currently trying to come up with a video on the structural unity of Torah, which we kind of touched on today. That's my next one. Usually create shorts about twice a week, usually during the week, and then one at the weekend. I'm kind of going through the different people groups right now. I think I've got 2 out right now, one on the Amorites and the other one on the Hittites. That's not the same as the Hittite Empire, but that's currently what I'm doing. I plan on doing some videos on Isaiah as far as authorship is concerned, because there's a whole, it's similar to the authorship of the Pentateuch, like the debate and how it all formed, and it, like, it's similar but different because it's the prophet and not the Pentateuch. Right. So I got that coming up. That'll be a few weeks out though, because I'm not done with my research yet. So that's what I got coming up.
So the 27 Isaiahs. I love that. The theory always makes me laugh every time I hear that.
The ever shrinking Isaiah too.
Yes, the ever shrinking Isaiah.
How much of Isaiah of Jerusalem is in there? It's crazy. It goes more than just 1, 2, 3 Isaiah.
This is, I think, one of those things that the New Testament people don't have as much of a problem with worrying about. This whole, they're fighting about stuff that, it's like, this letter says this was written by so and so, and they're still arguing about it. But then you got our problem of who wrote Torah, and did Moses write Deuteronomy? Well, obviously he didn't write the last couple chapters after he's dead. So you've got that death. Like there's a whole lot that I'm going to do a whole episode on authorship in the Old Testament.
I'm the most humble man in the world. That was another one.
I love the idea of the inspired editors, because that is a big piece of how that works. And scribes who collected
Absolutely.
all these, we'll get into that I'm going to do a whole other episode on that. It will be a whole different thing. But anyway, so the link to Adam's channel is down below, and there is also a credit down there, a quote from our friend Spencer, who really helped me out with some of the Leviticus stuff and helped me refine the Day of Atonement stuff. So he was really helpful there. And of course, Phil, who probably isn't here anymore, and Troy, and several people who really helped bounce some ideas off of. And I just love nerding out about this stuff. So thank you, Adam. And we will be back hopefully next week, and we'll be talking about the ethics of Torah and how all that works. So go and be blessed. And I hopefully will see you again next week. All right. Take care, everyone.